this regard, I quote, "With increased resources, Europe will be able to pursue the achievement of one of its essential tasks, namely the development of the African continent." End of quotation. Of course, those were times when the inevitable imminent provincialization of Europe was something totally out of consideration. In the framework of a redefinition of the European idea right after the Second World War, it is clear that the fantasy of centrality implicit in Schumann's illusion, as a willing or non-willing modern version of the white man's burden, was based on the fact of Europe's colonial domination over large parts of the African continent. But this is not the whole story. That same idea of Europe itself remains to this day fraught by contradictions and heterogeneities that are inseparable from the symbolic constitution of strong patterns of identity which project themselves onto other European countries or regions in the form of stereotypes that are distinctly framed by colonial difference. Thus, when Angela Merkel demanded on May 17, 2011, that Southern Europeans should go less on holiday and retire later in life, meaning that they should work harder and, if I may add in my own words, stop being such a lazy bunch, this was not just a demonstration of the power of stereotypes, that it may be argued played with dire consequences and not insignificant role in the protracted, insufficient response to the financial crisis. The stereotypes themselves can easily be recognized as projecting an image of the Southern European molded after colonial prejudice. Such a projection has a long tradition. In her book Imagining the Balkans, Maria Todorova, drawing on Said's Orientalism, defines Balkanism as a discourse formation that projects the purely negative, if not pejorative, image of a semi-existence. In the dominant European imagination, the Balkans, Todorova writes, are, I quote, semi-developed, semi-colonial, semi-civilized, semi-oriental. On a similar vein, in a groundbreaking text with the title Between Prospero and Caliban, Boaventura de Sousa Santos could abundantly show how the Portuguese national fantasy of a central position as a colonizing Prospero was counteracted by a North European nailing down of the Portuguese to the role of a barely civilized, colonized Caliban. Lord Byron famously described in Childe Harold the beauties of the Portuguese landscape as pearls given to swines, and images of the country found in travel narratives abound in allusions to the horrendous ugliness of the Portuguese, the ugliest race in Europe, this is a quotation, because allegedly formed of a mixture between Jews, Arabs and Negroes. And such travel narratives do not fail to mention the unwillingness to work, the inability to take advantage of the natural resources of the country in a rational way, and last not least, the essential immorality and promiscuity of people unable to refrain their sexual impulses in a civilized manner. All of these commonplaces that colonial discourse routinely applies to people in Africa. The discursive degradation of the South is consonant with the persistence and even reinforcement of a model of central periphery which reproduces at the inner European level a symbolic geography of power that is in several ways structurally similar to the stereotypes of colonial difference. Such stereotypical constructions, admittedly in less crude ways, can even be found in unsuspected places. Take the German notion of Kern-Europa, meaning core Europe or core European countries. It is perhaps not commonly known that the word was introduced in European discourse in the position paper Thoughts on European Politics, Überlegungen zur europäischen Politik, the so-called Schäuble-Lammers paper, from the name of the two German Christian Democrat politicians, Wolfgang Schäuble and Karl Lammers, who were responsible for this position taking. The word was later also used, among others, by Joschka Fischer, the one-time German Minister for Foreign Affairs, and was to surface sometime later in a central place. The joint appeal launched in 2003 by Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida in the wake of the Iraq War, with the title in the English version of February 15, or What Binds European Together, a plea for a common foreign policy beginning at the core of Europe. In the German version published by the newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the title referred explicitly to renovation and to a rebirth of Europe. Unsere Erneuerung nach dem Krieg, the Air War, die Wiedergeburt Europas. The manifesto is an appeal to unity, which in the eyes of the authors can only be fostered if the core member states are capable of initiative and of leading a process of reflection in the course of which, in the context of contemporary Europe's incomparable rich diversity, I quote further, the citizens of one nation must regard the citizens of another nation as fundamentally one of us. End of quotation. What is striking, on the one hand, is that the no doubt well-intended utopian thrust of the manifesto relies on a concept, core Europe, which implicitly reproduces the model of center-periphery I alluded to, and herewith a notion of difference grounded in an asymmetric relation of power and marked by an apparently insurmountable border. On the other hand, notwithstanding a final plea to reject Eurocentrism, the model presented in the paper of a relation to the other as, I quote, a reciprocal acknowledgement of the other in its otherness, end of quotation, and as the foundation of a possible future common identity, remains not only essentially abstract, but more importantly, focused on the relationship among European national states and oblivious of the fact that the history of Europe and the constitution of Europe took place to an important part outside the geographical boundaries of the European continent. Contemporary Europe, the authors write, has been shaped by the experience of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century and through the Holocaust. End of quotation. Only in the final short paragraph can a reference to Europe's colonial past be found. I quote, each of the great European nations has experienced the bloom of its imperial power. Each has had to work through the experience of the loss of its empire. With the growing distance of imperial domination and the history of colonialism, the European powers also got the chance to assume a reflexive distance from themselves, to perceive themselves in the dubious role of victors who are called to account for the violence of a forcible and uprooting process of modernization. Addressing the question of colonialism simply as, I quote, the forcible and uprooting process of modernization strikes me as a rather odd euphemism. But apart from that, the crucial issue to my mind is that the contemporary presence of the migrant and the refugee, of the masses of people knocking at the doors of Europe, disavows the idea of that growing distance to colonialism. In fact, in many respects, colonialism has to be seen as very much a defining factor, not just of Europe's past, but of Europe's contemporaneity. And the failure to thematize this in the end situes Habermas and Derrida's manifesto within the tradition of a utopian Europe discourse where the celebration of cultural diversity insufficiently reflects upon the conflictual nature and potential for violence of a definition of difference that runs through what Boaventura Sousa Sanchez named the abyssal line as a defining mark of colonial difference. To recognize that the colonial fracture is not a thing of Europe's past, but of its present, has several major consequences. A central one is no doubt the recognition of the continuing prevalence of racism. To come back to my initial references to the question of language, ethnographic research among migrant communities in Portugal easily identifies several cases of racist discrimination based on language. An African accent on the phone can easily cost the loss of a job opportunity or of a chance to rent a place to live. The Portuguese organization SOS Racism reports several complaints concerning, for instance, situations at the workplace where employees having a conversation in Cape Verdean Creole have been forbidden by the management to do so. Recently in Austria, there was intense debate on an initiative according to which school children should be forbidden to use any language other than German at school, including when playing in the schoolyard. The initiative was blocked But that this nonsense could have been seriously taken into consideration is utterly revealing. Despite the national tradition of so-called lusotropicalist discourse, that is, of a fantasy of peaceful interracial relations, Portugal consistently ranks at the top or near top position in several surveys. The international surveys on social attitudes of Europeans reveals that 52.9% of the Portuguese population indulge in biological racism, as against 31.2% in the UK. The figure for cultural racism is worse for the UK, Portugal 54.1%, as against 57.8% in the UK. All of this goes a long way to show to what extent integration or assimilation are always but a provisional condition. If you carry or are attributed signs of otherness, you must be prepared at any given time for situations when these can be activated and made operative as a mark of exclusion. These few allusions lead me to the central question I wanted to deal with as one of the crucial approaches to the issue of discourse and migration, the question of translation. The most current image for the translation process is the image of the bridge. At the beginning of the millennium, under the aegis of Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, UNESCO issued a manifesto that was the title Manifesto for the Dialogue Between Cultures, with the title Bridges into the Future. Reading this manifesto, one quickly understands that this is by all standards a well-intended but utterly naive proposal. One of the reasons for this being that the metaphor of the bridge was taken literally and taken for granted. The bridge is presented as the solution, while I would argue it should rather be presented as the formulation of a problem. In fact, if there has to be a bridge, it is because there is some gap to be overcome. And this is, of course, the key question. You have to think of the bridge not just as something that allows you to forget about the gap, but also as something that makes manifest the existence and persistence of the gap. In this vein, I tend to think of translation in agonistic terms, that is, in terms that rest on a notion of translation as a conflict. Since languages and cultures are by definition incommensurable, every theory of translation has to face the problem of untranslatability. In other words, the process of translation is the struggle to overcome this problem by finding a common measure for the understanding and putting into connection of what is irrevocably different. Every solution in this respect, however, as every translator knows or should know, is always precarious and in some way provisional. There are no universals of translation, no ready-made frameworks, since in the end everything is contingent on the particularity of the context of a given language and a given culture. Grounding the notion of translation in a concept of untranslatability is not to be confused with models of intercultural relationship that assume non-translation or the refusal to translate as the defensive basis of one's own identity. The most influential of such models being probably Samuel Huntington's infamous Clash of Civilizations, which indeed presents the utmost version of an insanity of identity, with its fundamental assumption of the self-containment of cultures, that in the best of cases can simply coexist, and in the worst case relates with each other through war. You may recall that in a clearly Schmittian manner, for Huntington, you only come to really know yourself once you have been able to identify your enemy. In the terms I am proposing, untranslatability is a useful reminder that the task of translation, rendering difference intelligible and finding a common ground for a relationship to difference, is not to be equated with assimilation. Kwame Anthony Appiah has put forward the notion of thick translation to signify processes of translation that incorporate a perception of the embeddedness of rituals and practices, including practices of discourse in complex cultural contexts. The notion of cultural translation has become current in recent years as a reminder that every relation between texts in different languages is a relation between different cultures. This is, however, not enough, since, as is evident, the notion of culture itself has undergone significant turbulence. As Clifford Geertz famously put it, cultures do not hold still for their portraits. In other words, cultures are dynamic, internally conflictive processes, and not simply established canons or stable repertoires. This is why, very much in this sense, Stuart Hall could state in the 90s that culture is not so much a question of tradition, but of translation, meaning that being in translation is a fundamental defining characteristic of any given culture. In a short article written at the beginning of the 90s, with the title On Translatability, Wolfgang Iser reminded us that translatability, I quote, implies translation of otherness without subsuming it under preconceived notions. In other words, to quote Iser again, in the act of translation, a foreign culture is not simply subsumed under one's own frame of reference. Instead,